So good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Lennon. I'm the chair of the State Planning Commission. And can I begin by acknowledging that we are on the land of the original owners, the Kaurna people, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present. Can I also say that we're in the movies this evening, so we're doing the kind of techno thing, and we've got a podcast going. We've got a live stream going to our friends and colleagues in non-metropolitan areas of the state. So a special welcome to anyone who is joining us from the regions in South Australia this evening. Can I also introduce three members of the Planning Commission who are here this evening. Helen Dyer, many as you know, professional planner, ex-local government CEO. Craig Holden, architect, residential property developer in the city. And Sally Smith, who is the state's most senior planner. I'm sorry, Nadia. Nadia is obviously hiding. Nadia is currently writing code, but she does policy work on a whole range of things, but she's currently specialising in some of the code writing. In the course of this evening, for elected members, we want to try and cover a range of things. So we're going to talk about some of the demand pressures that currently exist across South Australia. We want to talk about some of the challenges that exist, especially in infill development in metropolitan Adelaide, but the same patterns are true in regional cities. In particular, we want to talk about heritage and character and some of the public debates around that, and leading through that to what we see as the benefits of a new heritage system. And lastly, we want to talk about involvement and consultation going forward. It's important to stress what the planning system can and can't do. I think one of the things that I've come to realise in my time as chair is that, in a sense, at a community level, when you're dealing with your residents and constituents, there's an expectation that you're somehow dealing with kind of everything. So, you know, we could be talking about a residential development or a shop in a neighbourhood street, but the conversation can easily go into climate change or aged care or, you know, the jobs and the economy and everything else. In the planning system, we're not talking about everything in the world. We're talking about how the state's land can be put to its best purpose. And what happens is we have a chance through the development of policy to try and lay out what we're trying to achieve. And then the assessment process is the rules through which their application, as somebody who wants to do something with land, gets assessed. So it's not about everything about the economy, and it's not about global warming, and it's not about the ageing of the population per se. It's about all of those things in relation to how land is best used. The other thing is people kind of get confused in these things by this, you know, the shorthand would be this is all just about development and development is bad. And the truth is it all is about development because that's what the planning system is trying to influence. Development is actually the centre of all this. And that doesn't mean we approve everything. It's actually we're trying to approve the right things. So it's not about everything. It's about land in the context of society at large. And it is about development and getting the right things to happen. So the most complicated bit about it is it's not just about the here and now. For all of us involved in the planning system, our job is we are the custodians of the future. We not only have to respond to what's around us, but we have to respond to what we can see coming up, and we have to position our communities and our regions and the state in the best possible position given the knowledge we have. So early tonight I want to talk about some of those things, and I guess the starting point in South Australia is really about our population characteristics. So this is a summary of how the state is changing. And as you can see from this diagram, the population growth in South Australia compared to the rest of Australia is actually very modest. It's about 0.7 of 1%. And this summary here is showing that each year South Australia's population increases by about 13,000 people. And this is comprised of, just going through from left to right, 5,000 more births than deaths, the loss of 5,000 people who leave to go interstate, and that's mainly young and skilled people. But I need to say there have been encouraging statistics that suggest that actually might be slowing. And the arrival of around 13,000 overseas migrants into South Australia. So between now and 2030, the state's population is projected to grow to almost 1.9 million people. And most of this growth is occurring in metropolitan Adelaide and around its fringe. More than any other state, and Australia is a very urbanised, highly urbanised country, our population is concentrated within the capital city. So just over 77% of the state's population lives in Adelaide. Although this pattern of capital city dominance is long established, it appears to be going the wrong way in that it's increasing. So the Premier and the Minister in particular are keen to see whatever we can do to boost the growth of regional South Australia. And of course, some of the policy changes on the distribution of migrant intake are focused upon that. Now, the implications of this, of course, are varied. The most important of this, and it applies to some of us in the room more than others, is that we are ageing. And ageing is a good thing, I say every morning in the mirror. How did I turn into my father? There's this kind of pivotal moment when I put a cap on and I thought, God, I've turned into my dad. But apparently it happens to all of us. We all get to this point, and it's like, so. But it's a good thing because it's really about these extraordinary influences of science and health science in particular that are extending life age. And at the last census, just under 18% of South Australians were aged 65 and over, while 58% were of working age, and almost 1/4 were children and young people under 20. Looking to the future, the proportion of South Australians aged over 65 is projected to grow more quickly than any other age group. The thing about demography, of all the speculative parts of it, like interstate migration, fertility rates, immigration, overseas migration, those things respond to policy. But the thing we actually can predict with the greatest certainty is aging, because those people exist. We know the proportions that stay here, and we can see over time what's going to happen. So this is the thing we can be most confident about. So of these slides on the board, there are two characteristics in particular I want to draw to your attention. By 2030, so this is only 11 years' time, 22% of South Australians will be aged 65 and over. But over this next 20 years, our active retirees will increase by 41%, but the proportion of the population between 80 and 100 goes up by a staggering 120%. And there's a kind of, for those of you that are interested in the science around this, there's a kind of basic element that goes that the longer you live past 55, the greater your propensity to live longer. So it's not an arithmetic projection, it's a kind of geometric progression, which is kind of encouraging. So Michael's nodding at the back because it's clearly given him some kind of reassurance. The super's going to have to last longer than you thought. The issue for us, though, is in a serious way, is we've got this remarkable thing of white people living to these extended periods, but we have to ask what kinds of lives people are going to live, and what does that mean for our streets and neighbourhoods? Because this is combined with two other characteristics. One of the biggest changes, arguably the biggest single societal change in the last generation, has been women having control of their own fertility. And what that's done is two things. One is it's reduced the number of children that families are having, and secondly, it's delayed the time when women are having their first child. So these factors combined means that the number of people living in a dwelling are going down steadily. So it's really important. So the occupancy rate, the number of people living in each dwelling, is falling through the floor and has been for some time. And that characteristic is one of the reasons why we're seeing this diversification in housing types. And what you would see not only in metropolitan Adelaide in the city, where of course we're seeing a repopulation of Adelaide, Craig, for the first time in 40 years. Really, and so this is Craig's bread and butter. But it's also true in the fringe, where we're seeing a diversification and a greater variety of land types and housing types, and it's also true in regional South Australia. So traditionally we might have thought we lived on a house dominated by individual separate houses. In the last decade, though, the proportion of separate housing and housing stock has increased by around 3%. Replaced by a growth in the stock of semi-detached dwellings. So we're seeing more dwellings on smaller lots, we're seeing more medium and higher density dwellings, row dwellings, terraces, units, and we're seeing the growth of apartment buildings. So Seinfeld is becoming a documentary for lots of people. Now we expect that to continue, and I think we need to make it clear as well that this has profound implications for the consumption of land. So if we look, and I apologise to our friends in regional South Australia, because I'm going to dwell on metropolitan Adelaide a little bit, but these patterns are true in regional towns and cities as well. We're in the midst of a historically important shift away from broadacre greenfield developments in the outer suburbs towards infill development. Now we know that in the regions there has been some change in that, where both the sea changers and tree changers are going to live in the country, or they're going to live in by the sea, and that's helped compensate the loss of younger people who are traditionally migrating from those places into the city. In a sense, though, the bigger change, though, is less about those basic lifestyle changes. It's more about the overall pattern of greenfield versus infill. So in barely a decade ago, it used to be roughly that 70% of new development occurred on the fringe of metropolitan Adelaide, 30% infill. Within 10 years, that has been reversed. So we're now seeing much, much higher proportions of infill development and a significant slowing of growth of Adelaide in the fringe. Having said that, for a population of less than barely 1.2 odd million people, because of Adelaide's geography and the way in which urban expansion has been managed, we now have nearly 100 kilometres from Gawler down to Selix in this increasingly narrow strip. So the consequences for that have been recognised by society making some great big decisions, like the character preservation zones, which has said that the Barossa, the Adelaide Hills and McLaren Vale, crucial for food production, horticulture, but also the identity of who we are as a people, the landscapes we want to preserve and how we want to live. So these options about where population is going to grow in the future are being constrained not only by our geography of flat plains, hills and sea, but also by the choices we're making about preserving things like the Hills Face Zone, character preservation areas, the wine districts, and things that make up our unique identity. Now this has significant implications for the kinds of changes that are taking place across metropolitan Adelaide. One of the things that we've been looking at lately, and this is something that we hope we can engage with individual councils upon, is some of the fantastic work that's being done in Dipti on demography can now be translated right down to local areas, so where we can see at the municipal level the proportion of population change that's driven locally across Australia and interstate, and the figures are quite staggering and very different. The eastern suburbs of Adelaide's population has been driven from quite different things from the city of Adelaide, for example. Now, arising from this, it's been very clear from all the consultations that we've had, and remembering that as part of the new system, there is a duty on the Commission to consult and engage people, and centrally, local community representatives and local government, in trying to understand the kind of responses we're getting at the street and neighbourhood level. And we recently released an overview of neighbourhood growth and change, which is in your packs tonight. So our approach within the broad topic is to break it down into 4 subject areas. And the first of these that we've outlined is our approach to heritage and character, as well as design. We'll be releasing more materials on residential development and infill, and we'll be also releasing material on water-sensitive urban design and green infrastructure in the coming months. Now, we'll talk about some of the details in a moment, but very quickly, I want to just remind you about the way in which the new code is being introduced. So the Planning and Design Code is to be introduced by mid-2020. And so it's just over 12 months. It will bring together all the current 72 development plans. Its aim is to reduce the number of zones that we have, remembering how complex that has become. For those of you that have sat on council for a number of years and sat in planning committees, like, it's just become incredibly difficult and complicated to navigate what a reasonable interpretation of planning policies is. So we've got about 1,500 zones. The ambition is to try and bring that down to around 50. And in our engagement with your staff, I think, Sally, we have become increasingly confident that in things like residential zones, we can dramatically simplify and standardise the numbers of zones without compromising the quality or controls. The code is to be assessed through a 24/7 online platform by a portal, meaning that, and this is the kind of vision thing, whilst all the policy is being rationalised, the intention in a digital world where you can do almost everything on your phone is that a person will be able to use a tablet or a PC and be able to put in their details in one planning portal, and your staff will be able to do this as well and draw down all the rules that pertain to the use of land on that site. So you don't have to wade through endless material in order to try and understand it. So drafts of the code will be consulted later in 2019. Now, I've put this in quickly because in all of this, this is the background to the policy discussion, is that whilst we're writing the code, we're trying to deal with a number of issues simultaneously. So, I want to turn to the issues that are affecting everyone, and I guess the topic here tonight in terms of kind of local streets and neighbourhoods. What has become very clear is that we're seeing significant community concerns arising from these changed patterns of development in at least 4 areas. Traffic on local streets, the loss of vegetation and tree canopy, site coverage where existing buildings are replaced with more dense building forms, overshadowing and loss of privacy. So we've identified a number of challenges within the residential code that has led to this dominance of double garages, a lack of landscaping, low streetscape amenity across our suburbs. Now, you can see this kind of everywhere. Now, some councils are actually trying, in anticipation of the code, like Campbelltown, to try and deal with these issues kind of right now. We were talking to members at West Torrens last week, and you can see it in all the areas which are attracting investment. Of course, there are examples of very good development, but there's examples of development that actually take away from the intrinsic character that we've known, we know in a hot place like Adelaide we're losing very significant amounts of green canopy, and it's not on streetscapes or public parks, it's through clearance, site clearance before development occurs. In this hot climate, I remember as a kid, I came here when I was 16 from Scotland, and I remember standing in Hutt Street thinking like you were just sitting in, it was 43 degrees, not a blade of grass in sight. And look at the difference the plane trees have made in that boulevard. Some of this is not rocket science. In a hot, dry environment, we should be planting as much tree canopy as we possibly can. It's also the case that there are what we think are relatively straightforward things. Where a site is being divided into two, rather than having two separate accesses onto the site with two driveways, we know that we can have one access, preserve two street trees, and create opportunities for deep root planting in two parts of the front of the street. So in this first iteration of the code, there are a range of measures, Craig and Helen especially, where we think we can set standards which create incentives for quality development to lift the bar. And we want to be talking to you about what they should be. There's a whole range of other areas that are associated with this, but water-sensitive urban design, green infrastructure policies, there's a range of measures which we think sensible developers should anticipate because their customers will demand it. Amongst the areas that have caused a lot of attention, have drawn a lot of attention, is the issues around heritage and character preservation. Now, we would start off by saying that we recognise and fundamentally support heritage and the retention and articulation of character in local communities, and it's our job to work with you to ensure that that's the case. So we've recently released a proposed framework for dealing with these, and these are available as well in your packs tonight. So let's have a quick look at what this means. So there are 4 heritage overlays proposed in the new system. Now, we've gone through a process in the last, 18, 16 months that the Commission's been going, where we have been processing heritage DPAs by councils in regional South Australia and in the metropolitan area. They've gone through a rigorous process, and I think there is no question in our mind about the decision that has been made to firstly deal with nearly 2,300 state heritage places which will be transitioned into the new code, and the demolition controls that currently apply to those will apply in the future. The same applies to the state heritage places, transitions into the code with the same demolition controls. Crucially for you, there are 7,250 local heritage places and the existing heritage conservation zones and similar policy zone will be transferred into the code. Now, what it has caught everybody's attention is that there are nearly 11,810 contributory items which are not and cannot be recorded in the code because these properties have not been assessed as local heritage in the past. They have been seen as items which contribute to streets or neighbourhoods. And the issues are how do we use the policies that are being developed in additional overlays in order to articulate and preserve that character. So before I go into detail about these, I'd like to talk a little bit more about demolition control, because it does seem that people are uncertain about what is occurring. So the Commission has had a number of claims that the planning system is slashing heritage protection, creating open slather demolition and ransacking South Australia's older suburbs. It is wildly unfair and untrue to say that. And honestly, I could look everyone in the eye and say this is simply untrue, and some of the material being released is unfortunate and unprofessional in my view. I want to reassure you that under the new planning system, all state heritage areas, all local heritage places, all historic conservation and like areas will have demolition control, and it's simply incorrect to say that there won't be. The new system will provide rigour and specified criteria to ensure that heritage items are assessed consistently across the state. One of the things we're trying to do in deal with this huge, vast amount of information that's built up is have consistent, reliable, transparent information upon which predictable decisions can be made. So there are 4 overlays which I'll just list in some detail. So again, state heritage areas, state heritage places, local heritage places. Under the proposal, all will be transferred as I've mentioned. Now, 39 out of 68 councils have a local heritage place within their boundaries. So there's 29 councils that don't have any. All current local heritage places continue to be listed, and all local heritage places will be accurately mapped. And finally, all historic conservation zones or the like, and the nearly 12,000 contributed items within them, they'll transition into a new local heritage overlay. I think, in my view, one of the issues that has clearly been built up in people's minds is that the so-called contributed items imply that those items cannot be demolished. All heritage items have to go through a process and can be assessed for demolition. That has always been the case. So because we list items as local heritage does not guarantee retention, because people have rights to put forward proposals to say that buildings are uneconomic, they have structural failures, or there is something better that can be done. So all of the material that we've assessed, we can identify 112 existing contributing items which are outside the areas I've talked about. And we're dealing individually with the councils on the board here about how we can protect, give adequate protection to those 112 items out of 12,000. So in all of this, in addition, we have character areas which capture a desired future visual appearance to give our community. So I can give you examples about this, but I think you all know them. So Ballarat Street in Mile End, Cumming Street in Cowandilla, to use those as examples, all character areas will continue to be protected under a character overlay. Character areas will be accurately mapped in a state atlas. Special individual characteristics of these areas will be reflected in zones. The one thing that I can't say to you is that all of these places will be protected from demolition forever, and that wasn't the case last year and wasn't the case 10 years ago. But the policies and the demolition controls that exist will continue to exist. What I want to say to you as elected officials with policy skills and responsibilities is that whilst we're thinking about these streets and neighbourhoods within our councils, what are the opportunities for us to manage change well? How can we get the right kind of development? How do we make sure that when people age, they can age in their suburbs and neighbourhoods where they've spent most of their lives? If people want to live next to their families and their grandchildren, how do we have diversity of accommodation to do that? When we know that our suburbs are not only dealing with places to sleep and cook, but they're also where you bring up children. It's where often women have part-time work. It's where people have offices. How do we protect that? How do we ensure that our neighbourhoods have the ability to walk to local parks, that we have shops and a shop is not just about filling your fridge, it's where you meet your neighbours, it's where people in the street look out for each other and know that something's happening. So this is what we're trying to articulate in the code. How do we articulate the desirable way in which our suburbs can change to meet with the challenges of the future? Enough from me. Very interested and pleased to respond to either comments or questions that you may have. We might not have all the answers, but I can promise you we will either respond to you directly, and if not, we're going to take notes of the matters you raised and we'll come back to you individually. So thank you very much for your time, and very pleased to open it up to comments and questions from you.